Seller finds an old photo inside a luxurious mansion and realizes that the man in the photo is his father, who has been missing for 20 years. Ethan Wilkes's life was a constant battle between a bleak present and the memories of a past that had never been fully clarified. At 26, he was the kind of person who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, taking care of his sick mother and trying to survive by selling door to door with no time or energy for big ambitions. His days were filled with long walks, the sun beating down on his face as he knocked on strangers' doors, hoping to sell something to keep the household going. The small house where he lived with his mother, Caroline, was modest and worn down by time. The garden, once flourishing, was now overgrown with weeds. The windows creaked when the wind blew, and the paint on the walls was faded, just like the life that once filled the house. Caroline spent most of her time bedridden, fragile, and weakened by the illness that consumed her, exacerbated by the sorrow that never left since her husband, David, disappeared 20 years ago. Ethan remembered that day clearly. He was only 6 years old when his father left for work and never returned. The searches were intense at first, but as time passed, people began to give up. Caroline, however, never did. Even years later, she continued to wait for David's return, as if he could walk through the front door at any moment. Ethan, on the other hand, had to bury that hope. Growing up without his father forced him to mature too quickly. He learned to take care of himself and later his mother, assuming responsibilities that should never have fallen on the shoulders of a teenager. David's disappearance had always been a mystery. He seemed like a man who loved his family and did everything to ensure the well-being of Caroline and Ethan. They didn't have much, but the love they shared seemed enough. David was a man of few words, but always kind. The last clear memory Ethan had of his father was from a hot summer day. David had called him into the yard and with a smile, pulled a silver pendant from his pocket, placing it around his son's neck. "This is for you, my boy. Never forget me. No matter where I am, I will always be with you." Those words were etched into Ethan's memory. Even as a child, he felt the weight of those words, as if David knew something was about to happen. From that day on, Ethan never took off the pendant. He wore it as a reminder of his father and at the same time as a symbol of all the unanswered questions that haunted his mind. Now, as an adult, Ethan felt trapped in a life with no way out. The days were long, monotonous, and the future seemed like an endless road. He continued his daily sales, going in and out of strangers' homes, trying to hide the exhaustion in his eyes and the worry about his mother. He knew her time was running out, and that terrified him. She was all he had left, and he couldn't imagine what life would be like without her. It was on one of those ordinary days, as he was finishing his sales in a more remote part of town, that his phone rang. It was an unknown number, and Ethan hesitated for a moment before answering. On the other end of the line, a formal voice introduced himself as Jason Collins, a local real estate agent. Collins explained that he needed someone to do a quick evaluation of an old mansion on the outskirts of town. The property was about to be sold, but there were valuable items inside that needed to be identified before demolition. "I heard you do work like this. It's not a complicated job, but the mansion is a bit out of the way. I believe I could pay you well for it if you're interested," Collins said, with a voice that indicated urgency. Ethan hesitated. It wasn't the kind of job he usually took, but the money seemed tempting. He could pay off his overdue bills and maybe even buy something better for his mother. Plus, the description of the mansion piqued his curiosity. There was something about old properties that intrigued him. He imagined the secrets that could be hidden within those crumbling walls, the stories of people who once lived there and were now forgotten. "All right, I'll do it," Ethan responded, trying not to show the excitement he felt about finally doing something different from his usual routine. In the following days, he prepared for the task. The journey to the mansion was long and solitary, surrounded by narrow, winding roads and empty fields that seemed to stretch on forever. The desolate landscape gave the trip an almost melancholic tone, as if he were leaving the real world and entering a place forgotten by time. When he finally arrived at the property, Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. The mansion was immense and imposing, even in its state of abandonment. The walls were covered in moss, and the windows broken in some places, looked like vacant eyes watching him as he approached. The iron gate groaned as he pushed it open, and the sound echoed in the surrounding silence. The garden was overgrown with weeds, and what had once been a beautiful landscape now resembled a horror movie scene. As he opened the front door, which was unlocked, Ethan was greeted by a blast of cold air and the smell of mold. The interior of the mansion was even more impressive. The high ceilings and dusty crystal chandeliers indicated that the place had once been filled with grand wealth. The furniture was covered with white sheets, and the wooden floors creaked with every step he took. The sound of his breathing seemed to be the only noise in that vast emptiness. As Ethan explored the mansion, the feeling of familiarity grew. There was something about the place that stirred him in a way he couldn't explain. It was as if at some point in his life he had seen those walls, felt that atmosphere. But that was impossible. He had never been there before. At least that's what he thought. Determined to finish the job, Ethan climbed the stairs to the second floor, where the bedrooms were. The sunlight filtering through the dusty curtains was weak, casting long, mysterious shadows down the corridor. Every door he opened revealed a dusty room, with old furniture and scattered objects as if the owners had left in a hurry without looking back. At the end of the corridor, a smaller, narrower door caught his attention. It was slightly ajar, and behind it, a wooden staircase led up to the attic. Ethan felt a chill in his stomach as he ascended. The attic was dark, filled with old boxes and items that seemed to have been thrown there carelessly. Among all the boxes, one in particular caught his attention. It was a dark wooden box with delicate carvings on the sides covered in dust. Ethan knelt and opened it, revealing a pile of old papers and photographs. As he rummaged through the contents, a faded photo slipped from his hands and fell to the floor. When he picked it up, he felt his heart race. In the photo, a group of people posed, smiling for the camera. But what really made Ethan's blood run cold was the man in the center of the image. He looked familiar, very familiar. Ethan brought the photo closer to his eyes, trying to understand what he was seeing. That's when he noticed something that took his breath away. The man in the photo was wearing a silver pendant, the same pendant that Ethan wore around his neck. Ethan's heart pounded so hard that he could barely hear his own thoughts. He stood there frozen, holding the photo in his hands, unsure of what to think or how to react. The man in the image, who seemed so relaxed and at ease, was his father, David Wilkes. There was no mistaking it. The face, the familiar features, and the pendant. The very same pendant that David had given him as a child. The one Ethan had worn around his neck every day since his father disappeared. He looked down at the pendant hanging from his own neck, and the confirmation hit him like a punch. This wasn't just a coincidence. It was real. That man, dressed in a fine suit, surrounded by people Ethan had never seen before, was indeed his father. But how? How had David ended up there, in a mansion Ethan had never heard of? And who were these people smiling around David as if they were old friends? The questions began piling up in his mind, but the answers felt more distant than ever. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. What was his father doing in that photo? Why had he never mentioned anything about this mansion? His father had always been described by his mother, Caroline, as a simple man, dedicated to his family and work. The kind of person who would never be involved with something as grand and decayed as this mansion. Overcome by a mix of confusion and urgency, Ethan picked up the photo and examined it more closely. The group of people seemed to be at some kind of formal event or gala. Everyone was dressed in fine clothes, as if attending a high society gathering. The mansion in the background looked immaculate, very different from the abandoned state he had found it in that day. What had happened to this place? And more importantly, what had happened to his father? Ethan began rummaging through the box in search of more clues. There were photographs, old documents, and letters yellowed with age. None of them mentioned his father by name, but the images showed him in different moments, always alongside the same group of people. Some of the photos dated back 20 years, while others appeared more recent. There was something unsettling about all of it, something that made Ethan deeply uncomfortable, as though he was unearthing secrets that were never meant to be discovered. In a sudden rush, he put the photos back in the box and closed it. His heart was still racing, but he needed to think. He needed to understand what this all meant. Why was his father involved with these people? And more importantly, why did he disappear shortly afterward? Determined to get answers, Ethan quickly descended the stairs, retracing his steps through the mansion's dusty rooms. He opened drawers, rifled through closets and old trunks, searching for anything else that might give him a clue. But the mansion seemed intent on guarding its secrets, as if time had swallowed them up. Every step he took in that gloomy space felt muffled by the dust of the years, as if the past was lurking in every corner, waiting to be uncovered. Finally, tired and frustrated, Ethan returned to the entrance hall. The weight of the discovery bore down on him, and he knew he was only at the beginning of a much longer and more dangerous journey. He looked once more at the mansion around him, as though hoping it might suddenly speak to him. But the silence was absolute. He took a deep breath and, unwilling to return home without understanding what was going on, he decided to leave and gather more information. The city was full of old stories, and surely someone knew about the mansion and its previous owners. Who were the people in that photo? If he could identify them, he might be able to trace a connection to his father's disappearance. As he shut the mansion door, Ethan had the feeling he was leaving something unfinished behind. It was as though the place was whispering to him, inviting him to return and learn more. But the time for that had not yet come. The sun was already setting, casting an orange glow on the mansion's facade, and the cool evening breeze made Ethan pull his jacket tighter around him. He needed to be methodical. He couldn't let emotion take over. All he knew so far was that his father had been involved with people tied to the mansion. But why? And how did this connect to his disappearance? Back in town, Ethan stopped at a small cafe, ordered a coffee, and opened his laptop. He needed answers, and quickly. The first thing he did was a quick search on the mansion. After a few attempts and variations of keywords, he found what he was looking for. The property, according to records, belonged to the Lockhart family, a prestigious family who, decades ago, controlled part of the local economy with businesses ranging from construction to more obscure ventures that no one spoke of openly. As Ethan read more about the Lockharts, his stomach tightened. They were described as powerful, influential, and ruthless. The family had a long lineage of people involved in scandals, disappearances, and betrayals. Though many of these stories were relegated to the status of urban legends, Ethan began to realize that somehow his father had become entangled with this dangerous world. He knew he was treading on dark ground. The more he read about the Lockharts, the more he felt he was getting close to something big, but also something dangerous. David Wilkes was not just an ordinary man, as his mother had always believed. There was more to the story than Ethan could have ever imagined. On one of the pages he found, an old headline caught his attention: "Mysterious Death at Lockhart Family Gala." The date was from 20 years ago, just before his father's disappearance. The article mentioned an incident at one of the Lockhart's parties where a man had died under mysterious circumstances. Though the victim's name was not released, the article hinted that the party involved influential figures and that the police never thoroughly investigated the case due to the Lockhart's power. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Could it be possible that his father was somehow involved in this event? The date coincided almost exactly with the time his father disappeared. That party, could it be the same one from the photo he found in the mansion? The pieces were beginning to come together, but there was still much to uncover. As he processed the information, Ethan looked out the cafe window, watching people pass by on the street. It was hard to believe that he had spent his entire life without knowing these dark secrets. Secrets that were now surfacing, threatening to rewrite everything he thought he knew about his father. David Wilkes was not the man he thought he was. That much was clear. But the question that now haunted him was, what exactly had his father done to disappear like that? And who was involved? The weight of this new reality began to settle on Ethan. He was digging into old mysteries with deep and dangerous roots. Somehow he knew that his life would never be the same after this discovery. But he couldn't stop now. The path to the truth was just beginning, and Ethan knew that if he wanted to find answers about his father, he would have to keep digging, no matter how dark the story was that he was about to uncover. Ethan couldn't shake the image of the photo from his mind. His father's face, smiling among strangers in a mansion Ethan had never heard of. What was David Wilkes doing there? The man who had disappeared without a trace was involved in something much bigger and darker than his family had ever imagined. For Ethan, just seeing his father in the picture was enough to send him spiraling into a world of unanswered questions. He knew he couldn't return to his normal life until he understood what had really happened. Ethan's first step was to dig deeper into the Lockhart family, the former owners of the mansion. They were almost mythical figures in town, though most people only knew vague stories about them, wrapped in rumors and secrecy. The family controlled a vast business empire, ranging from real estate investments to less transparent enterprises. For decades, the Lockharts dominated the social and economic scene, throwing extravagant parties, making shady deals, and, according to rumors, weaving a web of intrigue that ensnared everyone around them. Ethan knew he was dealing with something dangerous, but curiosity gnawed at him. He began investigating further, trying to understand how his father fit into this puzzle. He spent hours at the city library combing through old newspapers and public records. With each new discovery, the story grew darker and more complicated. During one of his visits, Ethan found an intriguing article in an old newspaper. The piece, dated 20 years earlier, mentioned the Lockhart family and a gala that ended in tragedy. The article referenced the mysterious death of a man during an event at the same mansion where Ethan had found the photo. The details were scarce, but the death seemed to be shrouded in suspicious circumstances. The victim's name was not revealed, and the Lockhart family had managed to bury the case, making the police investigation disappear from the public eye. The connection between this gala and his father's disappearance was impossible to ignore. With his heart racing, Ethan followed another lead: his father's business dealings before he vanished. His mother, Caroline, had always said that David worked as a manager at a local construction company. It was a simple life, with regular hours and little involvement in social activities. However, as Ethan dug deeper into old records, he uncovered something unsettling. In the months leading up to his disappearance, David had started working on a project for the Lockhart Corporation, a company he had never mentioned to the family. What was even stranger was that, upon further investigation, Ethan found evidence that David had gained access to the inner circles of the city's elite, a secret group that controlled everything behind the scenes, from politics to illegal activities. David was getting too close to something dangerous. Ethan realized that his father, by all appearances, had become entangled in something far more significant than he had imagined. David's involvement with the Lockharts could have been the deciding factor in his disappearance. The questions were beginning to align, but the truth was still buried deep. If his father had such deep ties to this powerful family, could it be that he had uncovered too much and was silenced for it? Determined to find out more, Ethan began visiting places where his father used to go before he disappeared, hoping to find someone who remembered him. Bars, shops, and former coworkers were his starting points. The answers, however, were always vague. No one seemed to know much about David's final months. His colleagues remembered him as a reserved man, dedicated to his work, but they had noticed a change in his behavior in the months leading up to his disappearance. He seemed more distracted, as if something was troubling him. An old friend of David's, Frank Harris, mentioned that the last time they spoke, David talked about something big that was about to happen, but he didn't give any details. Ethan immediately knew Frank was referring to David's involvement with the Lockharts. After weeks of searching, Ethan came across a name that piqued his interest: Richard Lockhart, the family patriarch who had been in charge of all business affairs at the time. Richard was known as a powerful and ruthless man, someone who moved the pieces on the board with cold precision. According to rumors, he controlled everything, and anyone who dared to betray or defy him was either excluded or disappeared. David, it seemed, had gotten too close to Richard Lockhart in a way no one knew about. But why? For Ethan, this discovery only raised more questions. How had his father, an ordinary man with a simple life, become involved with such a powerful figure? What had David discovered or done to have his life cut short so abruptly? And why had no one ever spoken about this? There were secrets people were determined to keep buried, and Ethan felt that he was getting dangerously close to the truth. Things took a darker turn when Ethan realized he was being followed. He noticed a constant presence in his steps, someone always lurking in the shadows, watching him closely. At first, he thought it was paranoia, a result of his growing obsession with uncovering his father's past. But over time, it became clear that he was stirring up something that unsettled powerful people, the same people who might have made his father disappear. One of the tensest nights came when Ethan received an unexpected visitor. He was at home going over the notes he had made about the Lockhart family and their connection to his father's disappearance when a loud knock echoed from the front door. When he opened it, he found a middle-aged man with a stern look. The man introduced himself as Marcus, a former employee of the Lockhart Corporation, and said he needed to talk to Ethan urgently. "You're digging where you shouldn't be," Marcus said in a grim tone after entering Ethan's small apartment. "The last person who tried to do this disappeared, just like your father." Marcus's words were a shock to Ethan, but at the same time, they confirmed what he had already begun to suspect. His father was involved in something dangerous, and now Ethan was following the same path. "Your father tried to get out, understand?" Marcus continued. "He wanted to escape what the Lockharts were doing, but no one simply leaves. They don't let you, and now you're drawing too much attention to yourself. Stop while you still can." Ethan looked at Marcus, his thoughts spinning in a whirlwind. All he wanted were answers, but it was clear those answers could cost him his life. Even so, he couldn't stop now. David Wilkes was his father, and he needed to understand what really happened. He deserved that truth. "I'm not going to stop," Ethan said, a newfound determination in his voice. "If you know something, tell me. I won't give up until I know what happened to him." Marcus hesitated. There was fear in his eyes, but also a kind of respect for the son who was willing to risk everything for his father. He gave Ethan some vague information, confirming that David had been involved in shady deals. But when he tried to leave, he became a threat to the Lockharts. Marcus couldn't say exactly what happened after that, only that David was caught up in something big. From that moment on, Ethan knew he couldn't turn back. The answers were within reach, but the price for uncovering them was becoming increasingly dangerous. Even so, he felt he was close to the truth. A truth that could destroy everything he thought he knew about his father, and perhaps even cost him his own life. From the moment Ethan realized he was being followed, the feeling of being watched by something larger never left him. The shadowy figure that appeared in dark corners and discreet alleyways was not just in his imagination. It was clear that his investigation into his father's past had drawn the attention of dangerous people. The constant presence of that observer was a silent reminder that he was treading on dangerous ground. What had his father, David, discovered or done to end up in this situation? The days following his conversation with Marcus were marked by growing tension. Ethan felt increasingly cornered, as if he were walking down a dead-end street. Marcus's words, warning him to stop while he still could, echoed in his mind. But at the same time, something deep inside him refused to let go. He needed to find out the truth about his father, the Lockhart mansion, and the secret that surrounded David's disappearance. Ethan decided to return to the mansion. There was something about that place that seemed to call out to him, as if the answers were hidden there, waiting to be uncovered. When he arrived, he felt the same heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had overwhelmed him the first time. Time seemed to stand still inside the mansion, as if it were trapped in a bubble of decay and secrets. The cold wind rustled the bushes, and the rusty gate creaked as it swung open. He entered through the front door once again and began to explore the rooms he had missed during his first visit. Every step echoed through the dusty wooden floors, breaking the eerie silence of the mansion. This time, Ethan was determined to search every corner, to find any clue that might shed light on his father's involvement with the Lockharts. In one of the larger bedrooms, he came across a locked cabinet. It was covered in dust, as if no one had opened it in years. Luckily, Ethan found a key in one of the drawers of an old dresser and tried it. The sound of the lock clicking open echoed through the room, and with a mix of excitement and dread, he opened the cabinet doors. Inside, there were a series of old documents, letters, and contracts. Apparently, all the papers belonged to the Lockhart family. Some were signed by Richard Lockhart, the family patriarch whose name was already etched in Ethan's mind as a figure he needed to understand better. But one document, in particular, made his heart stop for a moment. It was a business contract signed by David Wilkes. There it was, concrete proof that his father had been tied to the Lockharts. David had worked for them, but what exactly had he been involved in? Ethan started examining the papers more closely. It appeared that his father had been hired to assist with construction projects, something that made sense given his background. However, other documents indicated that David had gained access to confidential family information, putting him in a dangerous position. He wasn't just an ordinary employee. He knew too much. As he sifted through the papers, Ethan found a handwritten letter addressed to his father. The sender wasn't identified, but the words were clear and threatening. The letter spoke of betrayal, of keeping silent or facing dire consequences. The final lines made a knot form in Ethan's stomach. You know too much. It's better to stay silent, or the people you love will pay the price. The reality of what David had faced began to take on an alarming shape in Ethan's mind. His father had been caught in a deadly game of power and secrets, a game he had tried to escape but couldn't. Ethan wondered what had led his father to become involved with such a dangerous family. Was it out of financial necessity, ambition, or something else entirely that he still couldn't fully comprehend? And most importantly, what had David uncovered to warrant such threats? At that moment, Ethan heard a noise coming from the hallway. His body froze instantly, and he held his breath. He wasn't alone. In a quick movement, he switched off the flashlight he was using to read the papers and hid behind the cabinet, shrouded in shadows. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed across the wooden floor, slowly approaching the room where he stood. Ethan's heart pounded so loudly that it felt like the noise could be heard by the person on the other side of the door. Whoever had entered the mansion was searching the rooms and seemed to know exactly where to look. Fear mixed with adrenaline. He couldn't afford to be caught here. Not now. The footsteps stopped at the bedroom door. Ethan saw a shadow stretch across the floor as the door was slowly pushed open. He bit his lip, holding back any sound that might escape his throat. The person who entered was holding a flashlight and began scanning the room, moving with the confidence of someone familiar with the place. The beam of light danced across the walls and finally landed on the cabinet. The figure moved closer, the footsteps growing louder with each step. Ethan tensed, ready to react if necessary. Just as the cabinet door was about to be opened, a phone rang, breaking the stillness of the mansion. The sound made the intruder pause abruptly. They answered the call, and Ethan managed to overhear part of the conversation. The voice on the other end was calm but commanding. "Get out of there. We have something bigger to deal with now," said the voice on the phone. The man hesitated, looked around the room one last time, and left. Ethan waited for a few minutes, making sure the mansion was empty again. When he finally stood up, his body trembled with relief, but also with the certainty that he was being closely watched. Someone knew he was getting close to the truth, and now he was a target. After that night, Ethan realized his life was in real danger. It wasn't just about uncovering old secrets. There were people willing to kill him to ensure those secrets remained buried. He knew the Lockharts had power, money, and dark influences that stretched beyond anything he could imagine. The same fate that had silenced his father was now looming over him. Even so, Ethan couldn't give up. More than ever, he realized that discovering what had really happened to his father was also a journey to protect his father's memory. A memory that was being torn apart by layers of lies and betrayals. Back in the safety of his small apartment, Ethan began piecing together all the information he had gathered so far. Photos, documents, and the threatening letter. He knew the next step would be to confront the person responsible for all this. Richard Lockhart, the family's patriarch, the man pulling all the strings. But how could Ethan get close to someone like Richard Lockhart without being killed before he even reached the truth? The answer seemed to come from an unexpected place. The following night, Ethan received an anonymous message on his phone. "I know what happened to your father. We need to talk, but come alone." The message was accompanied by an address in an isolated area on the outskirts of town. Ethan knew it could be a trap, but something inside him told him this might be his only chance to learn the truth. Adrenaline coursed through his body. Ethan looked around his empty apartment, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. He knew that from this point on, there was no turning back. If he went through with this, He would be confronting the ghosts of his father's past and the dangers of the present. Ethan grabbed the silver pendant around his neck, the last gift from David, and closed his hand around it. He would do this for his father. The truth, whatever it was, would finally come to light. With his heart racing and the weight of the world on his shoulders, Ethan was ready for the next step, even if it meant risking his own life. The anonymous message on Ethan's phone felt like a dark omen. He looked at the screen again, reading and rereading the mysterious words. "I know what happened to your father. We need to talk, but come alone." The address was in an isolated area, an old factory on the outskirts of town, a place that immediately gave off the impression of a trap. Every survival instinct in Ethan screamed at him to ignore the message, but the possibility of finally uncovering the truth kept him from turning away. He knew the next step would be risky, perhaps the most dangerous one so far. But despite the fear gnawing at him, a new sense of determination pushed him forward. He couldn't just walk away. He couldn't disappear like his father had. The truth was within reach, and the path to justice was narrow and perilous, but necessary. That night, after receiving the message from the unknown sender, Ethan barely slept. He spent hours contemplating what was to come. He decided to keep the message a secret, not telling anyone, not even his mother, Caroline. She had already suffered enough with David's disappearance, and the last thing he wanted was to worry her further. Besides, if this was a trap, he didn't want to involve anyone else. Just after 11 p.m., Ethan left home and got into his car. The silence of the night was unsettling, and every sound he heard, the hum of the engine, the wind howling, the branches swaying, felt amplified, as if the world knew what he was about to face. The old factory was in a forgotten part of town, surrounded by empty fields and poorly lit roads. Ethan had passed through that area a few times before, but had never noticed the factory. Now, as he approached, a sense of dread settled in his chest. When he arrived at the address, the factory looked abandoned, its windows broken, and its walls stained with time. It was the kind of place where danger could lurk around every corner, and Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He parked the car a few meters away and got out, walking toward the entrance with his heart racing and his body tense. The factory was cloaked in near total darkness, except for a faint light flickering in one of the windows, a sign that someone was indeed there, waiting for him. He took a deep breath, held the pendant his father had given him, a gesture that connected him to David and gave him strength, and moved forward. As he entered the building, the musty smell of mold and rust hit his nostrils. The floor creaked under his feet, and the echo of his footsteps spread through the empty space. Ethan followed the flickering light, heading toward a small office at the back of the factory. When he arrived, a figure stood there, back turned to him, looking out through the cracked window. Ethan's heart pounded erratically. The silence between them seemed to stretch endlessly until the figure finally turned around. It was a middle-aged man, his face weathered by time, with a weary expression. He wore simple clothes, but his posture radiated authority. Ethan didn't recognize him, but his instincts told him this man was deeply involved in the events that had led to his father's disappearance. "You must be Ethan," the man said, his rough voice breaking the silence. Ethan nodded, trying to control the anxiety surging through his body. "Who are you?" Ethan asked, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. The man stared at him for a long moment before speaking. "My name is Victor Hale," he began, "and I used to work for the Lockharts, just like your father." The name made Ethan shiver. He had come across Victor Hale's name during his investigation, a mysterious figure who appeared in old Lockhart Corporation documents but had vanished from public mention over a decade ago. Victor Hale was known to be Richard Lockhart's right-hand man, deeply involved in the family's darkest business dealings. "Do you know what happened to my father?" Ethan asked directly, with no patience for evasions. He was tired of half-truths and secrets. Victor nodded slowly as if the answer weighed heavily on him. "David, your father was a good man. He got involved in this world out of necessity, not by choice. He started by helping the Lockhart family with legitimate projects, like any other employee. But soon he saw what was really happening behind the scenes. Illegal business, money laundering, blackmail. The Lockharts were involved in everything. David tried to leave when he realized how deep it went. But once you're in, no one just walks away. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his chest. It confirmed his suspicions, but it also deepened his fear. He had known the Lockharts were powerful, but the scale of their crimes was much larger than he had ever imagined. He tried to leave, but Richard Lockhart saw him as a threat. Victor continued, his voice growing darker. Your father knew too much, and Richard couldn't let that stand. That's when the threats started. Victor paused as if debating whether to continue. Ethan was on the verge of losing control. What happened to him? How did he disappear? Ethan asked, his voice cracking with the mixture of anger and fear. They got him, Victor replied, looking down. Richard ordered him to be silenced, but your father wasn't killed immediately. They kept him for a while, trying to extract information, trying to get him to stay quiet. When he refused, they eliminated him. The words hit Ethan like a punch to the stomach. The reality was far worse than he had imagined. His father hadn't just been murdered. He had been held captive, tortured for trying to do the right thing. Rage burned inside Ethan, and he clenched his fists, struggling against the growing pain in his chest. Where is he? What did they do to him? Ethan could barely get the words out. Victor looked directly into Ethan's eyes, his gaze heavy with guilt and regret. Your father's body is buried in the woods behind the Lockhart mansion, he said softly. They made him disappear, literally. No one ever found him, until now. Ethan stood in silence, absorbing the devastating truth. The tears came, but he held them back. Everything he had feared, the entire nightmare surrounding his father's disappearance, now had a brutal explanation. His father had been an honest man who had tried to fight against the overwhelming power of the Lockharts, and it had cost him his life. Before Ethan could fully process what he had just heard, Victor spoke again, this time with urgency. You need to leave town, Ethan, now. The Lockharts are watching you. They know you're close to the truth, and they won't hesitate to do to you what they did to your father. The threat hung in the air. Ethan knew he was being followed, knew he was in danger, but now the reality was much clearer. The Lockharts wouldn't let him walk away with this information. Why are you telling me this? Ethan asked, suspicious. If you worked for the Lockharts, why are you helping me now? Victor sighed, seeming to carry the weight of decades of regret. I tried to leave too, he said, but like your father, I was threatened. I did things I regret, and now I'm trying, in some way, to do the right thing. It's too late for me, but you still have a chance to get out. Ethan's heart was shattered, but his mind was clear. He had a choice to make now. Run and protect his life, or continue to seek justice, even if it meant risking everything. As Victor prepared to leave, Ethan felt that this moment marked the beginning of something greater, a fight not just for his father's memory, but for the truth that could bring down the Lockharts. He held the pendant around his neck and made his decision. That night, after the meeting with Victor Hale, Ethan returned home with a somber clarity in his mind. The answers he had sought for so long were finally before him. But what they revealed was far more terrifying than he could have imagined. His father, David, had been brutally murdered by the Lockharts, a powerful and ruthless family, simply because he had tried to escape their criminal circle. And now Ethan was next in line. But despite the fear that consumed him, a newfound strength took hold of him. He couldn't turn back. He couldn't simply disappear like his father. The truth was now out in the open, and the path to justice, although dangerous, had to be followed. As Ethan looked around his small apartment, filled with memories of a simple life with his mother, Caroline, he felt the weight of the decision he had to make. He could flee, as Victor had advised, disappearing before the Lockharts could catch him. But running away meant letting his father's legacy be buried along with him, as if David had never tried to stand up against the power and corruption of the Lockhart family. Ethan couldn't accept that. He wouldn't run. That night, as he prepared for what would undoubtedly be the turning point in his life, Ethan thought about his mother. Caroline deserved to know the truth, but she also deserved to be spared from the harsh, brutal details of that truth. He knew he would have to tread carefully, revealing the secrets without destroying the memories she cherished. In her eyes, David was a hero, and that wouldn't change. The next morning, Ethan went to his mother's house. Carolyn's pale, tired face reflected years of suffering and longing, but also the strength of a woman who had held onto a fragile thread of hope for far too long. She looked at her son with her usual love and concern, unaware that his life was in imminent danger. "You look tired, Ethan," she said as he walked into the small living room. "You've been working too much. You need to rest." Ethan smiled, trying to hide the pain that tightened his chest. He sat next to her and took her frail hands in his. He knew that what he was about to say would change everything between them. "Mom, I found out what happened to Dad," he began, his voice low but steady. Caroline froze for a moment, her eyes filling with a mix of anticipation and fear. She had waited 20 years for this answer, but deep down she knew the truth could be cruel. Ethan explained what he had discovered, but he did so carefully. He revealed that David had gotten involved in dangerous business dealings with the Lockhart family, and once he realized the true extent of their criminal activities, he tried to leave. Ethan spared her the most brutal details: the kidnapping, the torture, and the murder, shielding his mother from more suffering. He told her that the Lockharts had silenced his father because he knew too much, and that his body had never been found. Tears rolled down Caroline's face as she listened to every word. Ethan saw the deep pain in her, but also a sense of bitter relief. The wait was finally over. She knew what had happened to David. While the truth was painful, she could at least find some form of closure. "He was always a good man," Caroline whispered through her tears. "He only wanted to protect us. They took that away from us." Ethan embraced his mother, feeling her sadness blend with his own. But he knew there was something else that needed to be done, something that would ensure his father's memory wouldn't fade into the shadows of the Lockhart's crimes. After leaving his mother's house, Ethan made a final decision. He would expose the Lockharts and ensure that the truth came to light, even if it meant putting his own life at risk. He had gathered enough evidence: documents, photos, and the threatening letter addressed to his father. Now he just needed to find the right way to use it. With Victor's help, who was also willing to take down the Lockharts, Ethan compiled a detailed dossier filled with undeniable evidence. They decided to hand the materials over to the police while also ensuring that the press received a copy. The plan was simple: to create so much public pressure that the Lockharts could no longer escape the accusations. But the Lockhart family wasn't going to go down easily. In the days leading up to the dossier's delivery, Ethan noticed that he was being watched more intensely. He knew the Lockharts were aware of his movements. The threat of being silenced grew closer by the day. But Ethan was prepared. He had already sent copies of the documents to trusted contacts, ensuring that even if something happened to him, the truth would still come out. The night before the dossier was to be delivered, Ethan received an unexpected visit. As he organized the papers one last time, the sound of footsteps echoed outside his apartment. Before he could react, the door was kicked open and two men barged in. They were large, imposing figures, clearly sent by the Lockharts to deal with the situation. Ethan stood up, feeling his heart race, but kept calm. He knew something like this might happen. "You've gone too far," one of the men said in a low, menacing voice. "It's time to stop." Ethan looked at them, fear evident in his eyes, but also the determination of someone who was ready to fight to the end. "You can kill me, but the truth is already in the right hands," Ethan responded firmly. "The Lockharts won't get away with this." The men exchanged glances, realizing that Ethan wasn't bluffing. He had prepared everything. Even if they silenced him that night, the evidence was already out. The Lockharts were trapped. Suddenly, the sound of police sirens broke through the night's silence. Alerted by Victor, the authorities were on their way. The men hesitated for a moment, knowing their time had run out. Without a word, they left quickly through the door, leaving Ethan behind, his adrenaline still pumping. The next day, the dossier was handed over to the police and the press. The case exploded in the headlines. The Lockhart family was finally exposed. With the undeniable evidence collected by Ethan and Victor, the authorities began a deep investigation into the family, uncovering years of corruption, murders, and illicit business deals. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for Ethan. He had secured justice for his father. The truth at last had come to light, and David Wilkes's name was cleared. He was no longer a forgotten victim in a web of hidden crimes. He was remembered as a man who had tried to fight back against the dark power of the Lockharts and had paid the ultimate price for it. In the end, Ethan returned to the woods behind the mansion, the place where Victor had said his father's body was buried. He knelt on the ground, tears in his eyes, feeling his father's presence there, holding the silver pendant in his hands, the same one David had given him years ago. Ethan whispered, "You're at peace now, Dad. We did it." He knew that while the past had been dark and painful, there was now a sense of closure. He had not only discovered the truth about his father, but also found the strength within himself to fight for justice. If you got caught up in this exciting story and want to see more content like this, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. There's a lot more mystery, drama, and twists to come. And if you're still curious, click here and check out other suspenseful videos that will leave you on the edge of your seat. Until the next chapter of this journey.